Idle as trout in light, Colonel Jones, these Irish. Give them no coins at all. Their bones need toil, their characters no less. Trevelyan's seal blooded the deal table. The Relief Committee deliberated. Might it be safe, Colonel, to give them roads? Roads to force from nowhere. Going nowhere, of course. Sick, directionless, they worked. Fork, stick were iron years away. After all, could they not blood their knuckles on rock, suck April hailstones for water and for food? It has gone better than we expected, Lord Trevelyan. Sedition, idleness, cured in one. From parish to parish, field to field, the wretches work till they are quite worn, then fester by their work. We marched the corn to the ships in peace. This Tuesday, I saw bones out of my carriage window. Your servant, Jones. Barren, never to know the load of his child in you. What is your body now, if not a famine road? This is a poem by Evan Boland, one of Ireland's greatest poets, and in it she tries to come to terms with the horrors of the great Irish famine. It is without doubt the greatest catastrophe in modern Irish history. The population of Ireland in 1845 was 8 million. Within 5 years that had dropped to 6 million. 1 million Irish people died during the 5 years of the famine. 1 million were forced to emigrate. And the incredible destructive power of the famine was to scar the Irish psyche for generations. It affected the Irish economy, Irish politics, Irish society, Irish culture. Everything changed after the famine. And for those who emigrated, it also created a legacy of bitterness. They had been forced out of their country. They had been forced to flee, to leave. Many of them dying on the coffin ships that tried to carry them to a new life, a new beginning. It was estimated that on some of these coffin ships, up to 30% of those travelling never made it to the other side. And so those who did survive, both in Ireland and around the world, never forgot the legacy of the famine. The message that they had been left to starve while food had been exported from the country. And a big thing about this then centred around the issue of responsibility. Who was to blame for the famine? John Mitchell, the Young Ireland leader, he wrote later that God Almighty sent the potato blight, but it was the British who created the famine. And the lack of support in some quarters of Britain created anger and resentment. There was an article in the London Times newspaper during the famine in which it said that the arrival of the potato blight in Ireland was something that they considered a blessing. It went on to say that the indolent Irish preferred relief to labour. And it went on to say that it looked forward to the day when an Irishman in Connemara would become as rare as a Red Indian in Manhattan. For some in Ireland, the key villain was Queen Victoria, and certainly her government. Queen Victoria, it was said, gave £5 to help the relief efforts, and this was seen as a minuscule amount. In reality, she gave £2,000 and became patron of a charity that tried to aid the people. But in popular mythology, she became known as the Famine Queen, who hadn't really cared as her people died. British governments, successive British governments, also came under attack. And I think the question of who is to blame for the famine is something that must be explored. But I want to also give you a sense of another poem from one of Ireland's greatest poets, the Nobel laureate, the late great Seamus Heaney. Because in one of his poems, writing about potato digging, potato planting in the present day, he uses that to flash back in time to 1845 and the start of the famine. In the third verse, he tries to capture the horrors of the great Irish famine. Live skulls, blind-eyed, balanced on wild higgledy skeletons, scoured the land in 45. wolfed the blighted root and died. The new potato sound as stone, putrefied when it had lain 3 days in the long clay pit. Millions rotted along with it. Mouths tightened in, eyes died hard, faces chilled to a plucked bird. In a million wicker huts, beaks of famine sniped at guts, a people hungering from birth. Grubbing like plants in the bitch earth were grafted with a great sorrow. Hope rotted like a marrow. Stinking potatoes foul the land, pits turned pus into filthy mounds. And where potato diggers are, you still smell the running sore. And again there it captures how powerful, how emotive the memory of the famine is, even in the present day. In 1997, for the 150th anniversary of the worst year of the famine, Black 47, the then British Prime Minister Tony Blair offered an apology to the Irish people. In it he said that those who governed in London at the time failed their people. But that apology satisfied few. For some, it was too late. For others, it seemed a little ridiculous that 150 years after an event, a government that had nothing to do with the events of that time, whose party hadn't even been in power, whose party wasn't even in existence back then, should offer some kind of apology. Jeremy Paxman, the British commentator, called it an exercise in moral vacuousness. Others, though, resented just how unapologetic it was, that it was only a half an apology, that it didn't really get to the heart of what had gone wrong. For some, the Great Irish Famine was not a famine. It was a Holocaust. It was genocide. But I think there are problems with using those terms. First, I think it can be offensive. It can be offensive to those who perished in real genocides, in real Holocausts. It can be offensive to the 6 million Jews who died during the Second World War in what was a deliberate attempt by the Nazis to exterminate them. The Great Irish Famine, catastrophic as it was not a genocide. The British did not sit down and say, we will cut off food supplies to Ireland. We will wipe out the population. We want to murder the Irish people. Instead, they sat back because they felt their hands were tied by their own economic policies, their own value systems, their own beliefs. A liberal economic policy called laissez-faire, which said leave it well enough alone. Do not interfere in the market. If you do, everything will be destroyed. There's a website called irishholocaust.org which makes a case for this being a genocide. And I want to read you the opening from their website. And I think it will be a little bit shocking, but bear with me. It begins, Irish men and Irish women. And in doing so, it therefore deliberately, self-consciously mirrors the opening of the great, iconic 1916 proclamation. Irish men and Irish women, read this site and weep. Weep for the agonies and deaths of your young people at the hands of genocidists. Never, ever forget it. As no Jewish person would ever refer to the Jewish oxygen famine of 1939 to 1945, so no Irish person ought ever refer to the Irish Holocaust as a famine. And the language there, blunt, shocking, offensive, I think creates a problem for us because by trying to equate the two events, I think it lessens the tragedy of the Jewish Holocaust, and I think it misinterprets what exactly happened during the famine. Certainly the famine exerted a long legacy in Ireland, and all the way right up to the present day. Whenever there are famines around the world, the Irish give more per capita than any other country. It was what happened during Live Aid in 1986, itself an event organised by an Irishman, Bob Geldof. And Bob Geldof suggests that the reason why the Irish gave so much was because of their own long-term experiences of the famine. If we were to point a finger of blame, we could point it at those dominant economic policies. But I think we also have to acknowledge that some in Britain did see this as a visitation from God. They didn't cause the potato blight. That came from North America. It arrived in Ireland in September 1845 and immediately wiped out 1/3 of the potato crop. The blight didn't just hit Ireland. It hit Britain. It hit France and Belgium and the Netherlands. It went around continental Europe. The difference is that in those countries, once the potato crop was destroyed, they moved on to other things. They ate other foodstuffs. In Ireland, we had a population that was largely dependent on the potato. In Mayo, the county in the west of Ireland where my mother is from, 9/10 of the people relied solely on the potato. Now that's quite extraordinary when you think about it. And to think that 1/3 of the crop was destroyed in September 1845 and 3/4 of the crop was destroyed the following year in 1846. And because there were no seed potatoes then to sow, the crop was virtually non-existent in Black 47 in 1847. And you might fairly ask the question, why were the Irish so reliant on the potato? Of a population of 8 million, why was half that population heavily reliant on the potato? And why was 1.3 million completely reliant on it? And the answers can be traced all the way back to the penal laws in Irish history, where Irish families were forced to subdivide because they couldn't pass the inheritance down to the eldest son. And so farms grew smaller and smaller. And the potato then was a great crop to sow, because if you had an acre of land and sowed potatoes on it, that would give you enough to feed you and your family for the year. The potato was an incredibly nutritious food source. An average Irish male in this period ate 14 pounds of potatoes a day. It gave you all your nutrients, minerals and vitamins. It was especially healthy if you could mix it with a bit of cabbage and a bit of milk. But it was pretty much a complete food supply all in one. And it actually meant that the Irish were actually healthier in 1845 than many Europeans on the continent. They were bigger, they were stronger, they were taller. The potato, in a way, was a kind of a miracle food. And that is why when the blight hit Ireland in September 1845, it had the impact of a nuclear explosion. This was a catastrophe. And the British government was slow to respond because there had always been famines in Ireland. There had been one in 1822, one in 1817. There had been a huge one in 1740-41. This was part of the cycle. Every few years, there would be a famine in Ireland. And all they would do is wait for it to go away. What was different in these 5 years is that it was persistent. It continued, and they didn't know how to deal with it. Robert Peel, the former Chief Secretary, was in power in 1845-46. He imported in grain, Indian meal, which he sold at low prices to the starving people. And it was said that no one died while Peel was Prime Minister. But then Peel was kicked out of office because he tried to repeal the Corn Laws. He tried to bring in free trade to deal with the problem. And instead, Lord John Russell and the Liberals took over. And they were so wedded to their economic policies that the people starved. They tried to bring in relief acts. The relief works that Evan Boland mentions in her poem, roads that would go to nowhere. And so they could pay the workers. But many were too ill, too sick to work. Many died along those roads. They set up soup kitchens. Another religious group set up soup kitchens. And some used them as opportunities to try and convert the Irish. And then the phrase, taking the soup. In other words, losing your religion in return for being fed. That became a shameful thing in Irish history. Other religious groups like the Quakers performed brilliant work, and their work has never been forgotten. You had the workhouses, which had been established in the previous decades, becoming the last refuge for Irish families, but it was seen as a mark of shame to have to end up in the workhouse. And you also see then the beginnings, the acceleration of Irish emigration, bringing with them stories of the horror, stories of the tragedy, stories of what seemed to them like the indifference of a cruel British government. And for many, it reaffirmed that Ireland needed its own parliament, that an Irish parliament would never have allowed its own people to die in this way. They said, with much justification, that if this had affected Cornwall in England, 1 million people would not have died. They would have put aside their economic policies. So although it wasn't deliberate genocide, although it wasn't a deliberate policy to murder the Irish, certainly the finger of blame can be pointed at a British government that was incapable of dealing with the crisis and which failed the Irish people at the very time when it needed them most. I'd like to end with a poem by the mother of Oscar Wilde, Speranza, addressing the horrors of the family, a poem called The Itinerant Singing Girl. Fatherless and motherless, no brothers have I, and all my little sisters in the cold grave lie. Wasted with hunger, I saw them falling dead. Lonely and bitter are the tears I shed. Friendless and loverless, I wander to and fro, singing while my faint heart is breaking fast with woe. Smiling in my sorrow and singing for my bread. Lonely and bitter are the tears that I shed.